April 16, 1945. A sunny spring morning in Germany. On the road leading out of Weimar, a strange procession takes shape. Hundreds of people form a column. These are not prisoners or refugees. These are men in expensive wool suits and fedora hats. These are women in fur coats, wearing fresh lipstick and high heels. They chat and smile. Some laugh. From a distance, they look like a crowd heading to the opera or a garden party. These people are the elite of Weimar. They represent the wealthy, the educated, and the cultural aristocracy of the nation. But there is no music waiting for them. They are marching at gunpoint. On both sides of the column, American soldiers keep pace. The soldiers are grim. Their faces are covered in dirt. Their fingers rest on the triggers of M1 Garand rifles. The Americans are not smiling. They are escorting these citizens up a hill called the Ettersberg. The destination is 5 miles away. It is a place the locals claim they have never seen, a place they claim does not exist in their world. Its name is Buchenwald. The citizens complain during the hike. They point to the dust on their polished shoes. They call the march an outrage. Some believe this is a staged propaganda stunt. They think the Americans are exaggerating the facts. In their minds, they are innocent bystanders. Why did the Americans force them to walk? At first glance, it was a simple march. In reality, it was a confrontation with the unthinkable. General George S. Patton had visited the camp 2 days earlier. The footage shows the result. Patton saw the ovens, he saw the piles of clothes, he saw the private zoo the SS built for their own amusement, while prisoners starved nearby. The general decided the innocence of Weimar was a lie. Patton wanted to shatter the illusion. He gave the order to round up the most sophisticated people in the city. He intended to rub their noses in the raw sewage of their own history. He wanted them to see the piles of bone and the smell of the barracks. The citizens say they didn't know. Events accelerated as they reached the iron gates. The smile on the faces of the elite vanished. The truth was waiting inside. Thus began the first day of their reckoning. April 11th, 1945. This was the day the denial ended. This is the history of the parade of shame. It is the record of how a German cultural capital became the immediate neighbor to a slaughterhouse. Why did the local population stay silent? They claimed ignorance. But the geographical facts tell a different story. To understand the horror of Buchenwald, one must first look at the map of Weimar. Weimar was not an ordinary provincial town. It was the intellectual center of Germany. This was the city of Goethe and Schiller. It was the birthplace of the Bauhaus movement. The streets were lined with elite libraries, grand theaters, and manicured parks. The residents considered themselves the pinnacle of European civilization. They spent their evenings listening to Beethoven and discussing classical philosophy. At first glance, a paradise of art, but in reality, a facade for a massacre. Only 5 miles separated the town center from the barbed wire. A scenic, tree-lined road connected the two worlds. Up that hill sat the Buchenwald concentration camp. It was established in 1937. For 8 years, the camp functioned as a factory of death. It operated directly under the eyes of the Weimar elite. The logistics were seamless. SS officers bought houses in the quiet suburbs. Their wives spent money in Weimar's high-end boutiques. The officers attended the same symphony concerts as the local professors. The footage shows the reality of the geography. The smoke from the crematorium chimneys drifted over the city streets. White ash settled on the windowsills of the townhouses. The smell of burning flesh was a daily occurrence, but this was only the beginning. When the American Third Army arrived, the citizens of Weimar repeated the same 4 words. We knew nothing. They claimed the black smoke came from an industrial factory. They claimed the emaciated men working on the railroad tracks were ordinary volunteers. They lived inside a shell of manufactured disbelief. The sound of heavy gates swinging open is audible in the archives. On April 11, 1945, the American commanders gave an order. They did not accept the excuses. They forced the city to look. The bubble was broken. The era of silence ended here. April 11, 1945. The United States Third Army arrived at the gates. When Patton's Sherman tanks rolled into the perimeter, the SS guards didn't stay to fight. They dropped their weapons and fled into the woods. The surviving prisoners did not wait for an invitation. They rose up, seized the remaining arms, and took control of the watchtowers. Patton arrived 4 days later. He had already toured the camp at Ohrdruf. He believed he was prepared for the worst of humanity. He was wrong. Buchenwald was a different scale of horror. Why was this place different? It was the sheer volume of death. 20,000 prisoners were still alive inside the wire. They were walking skeletons. Grown men weighed 60 pounds. Children stood in silence, their faces void of expression. The footage shows. Patton walks through the main gates. He stops. In the central courtyard, a pile of bodies waits for the ovens. There are hundreds of them. The corpses are stacked like firewood, 5 feet high. They are naked. The skin is yellow and stretched over bone. Their eyes remain open. Patton was a veteran of 2 world wars. His nickname was Old Blood and Guts. He had seen thousands of men torn apart by artillery. But this sight broke his composure. He retreated to his quarters and opened his diary. He wrote, "I have never felt so sick in my life. This was not a battlefield. This was an assembly line for murder." Patton looked past the barbed wire toward the nearby fields of Weimar. German civilians were working. They plowed the soil. They hung white laundry on lines. They acted as if the air was clear. But the smell of rotting flesh was so thick that American soldiers were vomiting behind the barracks. At first glance, a peaceful village, but in reality, a silent partner in genocide. Patton turned to the local commander. He asked if the townspeople knew what was happening behind these walls. The commander shook his head. He told the general that the locals claimed total ignorance. Patton's face turned a deep shade of red. The sound of his riding crop slamming against his leather boot echoed in the silence. He didn't scream. He spoke with a cold, sharp precision. He called them liars. Then he decided to prove it. Patton summoned the provost marshal. He issued an order that has no parallel in the history of modern warfare. He didn't want the poor or the uneducated to see the camp. He wanted the elite. He ordered his military police to enter the city of Weimar. Patton gave specific instructions. Find the richest citizens. Bring the professors, the lawyers, and the businessmen. He wanted the people who had the most to lose. Events accelerated. The MPs moved out into the city. The lesson was about to begin. "1,000 civilians. That was the number General Patton demanded. He didn't want soldiers or party officials. He wanted the elite of Weimar, the doctors, the lawyers, the shop owners, and the wives of high-ranking politicians. Military police units fanned out across the city. They targeted the grand villas and the luxury boutiques. The orders were simple and direct. The MPs knocked on heavy oak doors and entered crowded shops. They told the citizens to put on their coats and prepare for a walk. General Patton is inviting you to visit your neighbors. That was the official message. The Germans reacted with confusion. Some showed open indignation. One man stood his ground and shouted that he was a doctor. He claimed he could not be ordered around like a common laborer. The MP did not argue. He simply raised his rifle and pointed it at the man's chest. The doctor started walking. A column of 1,000 well-dressed civilians began the ascent. It was a bizarre sight. Men in tailored suits and women in expensive furs marched up the steep hill. American jeeps patrolled the flanks of the column. Soldiers watched from the vehicle seats to ensure no one slipped away into the trees. The initial mood was light. Neighbors chatted about the weather and local gossip. Women paused to fix their hair and adjust their hats. To them, this was a minor inconvenience. They viewed it as a silly American game or a bureaucratic error. In the archive footage, some civilians even smile at the cameras. They had no idea what sat at the top of the hill. The march lasted 2 hours. As the column reached the crest of Ettersberg Hill, the talking ceased. The wind shifted. A specific scent hit the front of the line. It was not just the odor of rotting meat. It was the smell of industrial-scale death, stale, heavy, and greasy. It felt thick enough to coat the back of the throat. The women stopped smiling. Handkerchiefs were pulled from pockets. Scarves were doused in perfume and pressed against faces. The crowd tried to slow down or turn back. The MPS stepped in. They used their weapons to push the civilians forward. There was no stopping allowed. They reached the main entrance. The famous iron gate of Buchenwald stood before them. The wrought iron letters spelled out a message: Jedem das Sein, to each his own. It was a cruel Nazi joke frozen in metal. The civilians passed through the gate. They stepped directly into a landscape of total horror. The first thing they saw was the prisoners. "1,000 survivors. They stood behind the barbed wire in total silence. They did not move. They only watched. These were the prisoners the local civilians claimed they never saw. Thousands of eyes followed the fur coats and the tailored suits of the townspeople. Those eyes were hollow. No one screamed. No one attacked the fences. They simply stared. That collective stare was more lethal than a bayonet. The American soldiers formed a rigid cordon. They gripped their rifles and pushed the crowd toward the first stop of the forced tour, the crematorium. In the courtyard stood a wooden trailer. It was not empty. Bodies were piled 6 feet high. They were naked and skeletal. Limbs were tangled like discarded wood. Mouths remained locked open. The civilians stopped. The blood drained from their faces. One woman in a heavy fur coat pressed a hand to her mouth. Her knees buckled. She began to shake violently. Then she screamed and lost consciousness. She collapsed directly into the thick mud of the camp floor. An American MP stepped forward. He did not reach down to help. He did not offer a hand. He used his boot to nudge her shoulder. "Get up," he said. "You have seen nothing yet." At first glance, these were innocent neighbors. But in reality, they were witnesses. This was the moment the myth of the good German disintegrated. History books often soften these details. We do not. The Americans forced the line to move forward. They marched the civilians past the piles of dead. If a man turned his head to avoid the sight, a soldier grabbed his chin. The soldier forced his head back toward the trailer. "Look!" the soldiers shouted. "Look at what you did!" They entered a brick building. This was the pathology lab. The SS kept meticulous medical records, but they also kept trophies. Inside the room, items were laid out on a table. They were displayed like merchandise in a shop window. There were 2 shrunken heads. They belonged to Polish prisoners. There was no mistake. The civilians moved closer to the table. The camera records the scene. The townspeople are trembling. The smell of the room is overwhelming. But this was only the beginning. It got worse. The soldiers pointed to the next display. On the table sat a lamp. The shade was not one table, 1,000 citizens, human skin preserved in glass jars. This was the display at Buchenwald. On the wood lay fragments of tattooed flesh, cut from the bodies of dead prisoners. Ilse Koch, the commandant's wife, had a specific preference. She was known as the Bitch of Buchenwald. If she saw a prisoner with an intricate tattoo, she ordered their execution. The skin was then tanned and turned into lampshades. The civilians from Weimar stood before the table. The camera records their faces. Men in expensive suits are weeping. In the corner, 3 men are vomiting. General George Patton had ordered this specific display. He didn't want a military briefing. He wanted a confrontation with perversion. He wanted them to see evil in its physical form. An American officer stood next to the human remains. He spoke fluent, unaccented German. He shouted at the crowd. He asked how they could claim ignorance. These things happened in their own backyard. They went to the theater. They drank coffee in the town square, all while the smoke rose from the hill. The civilians remained silent. Their denial was gone. They stood in the dirt, stripped of their excuses. The tour moved deeper into the camp. They reached the quarantine zone. This was the small camp. Here, the SS left prisoners to rot from typhus. The smell was a physical wall. American soldiers wore masks to breathe. Patton's orders were clear. The civilians were not allowed masks. They had to inhale the scent of the dead. A former prisoner approached the group. He was a skeleton covered in skin. He stopped in front of a well-dressed German banker. The prisoner raised a shaking finger. He spoke. He remembered the banker at the train station. He had seen him. The banker had seen the prisoners. The banker had looked away. The banker collapsed. He fell to his knees in the mud. He sobbed the same phrase over and over. "I didn't know. No one moved to help him. Even he did not believe his own words. 1,000 citizens of Weimar finished the tour. They were broken. They walked through the main gate in absolute silence. There was no conversation. There were no smiles. The women's makeup was smeared by tears. The men's suits were covered in camp dust. They walked back down the hill toward their city of poets. But the view had changed forever. Every time they looked at the horizon, they saw the barracks. Every time they looked at the hill, they saw the bodies. When General Eisenhower received the report, April 12, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood inside the Ohrdruf concentration camp. He realized Patton's decision to document everything was essential. He did not wait. He sent an immediate cable to Washington and London. Send the press. Send the congressmen. Send the parliament members. Send the newspaper editors. He wanted witnesses with cameras and notebooks. Eisenhower wrote that the things he saw beggared description. He made the visit deliberately. He wanted to be in a position to give first-hand evidence. He feared a specific outcome. He worried that in the future, people would call these reports mere propaganda. Eisenhower anticipated the denial of the Holocaust. He knew that 50 years later, people would claim it never happened. He took action to prevent this. He forced the local German population to walk through the gates. He made them witnesses against themselves. The impact of the forced tour was immediate. That night, back in the city of Weimar, the pressure became unbearable. The guilt claimed lives just as it had in Ohrdruf. Several prominent citizens who walked the tour committed suicide over the following days. They realized their culture and education had failed. Their civilization had not stopped them from becoming monsters. They looked in the mirror and could not live with the reflection. Patton received the reports of the suicides. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He simply said, "Good, maybe the rest of them will learn." The forced tour of Buchenwald remains a critical historical marker. It raises a question that persists today. How much does the average citizen know about the crimes of their government? The people of Weimar did not pull the triggers. They did not turn the valves on the gas chambers, but they looked away. They remained silent while the chimneys smoked. Patton understood a hard truth. Silence is complicity. He believed you cannot claim innocence by closing your eyes. In April 1945, he forced them to look. In doing so, he forced the world to look. The citizens of Weimar walked up the hill as arrogant aristocrats. They walked down as broken accomplices. The ghosts of Buchenwald followed them home. The excuse, "we didn't know," is still used today. At first glance, they were civilians. But in reality, they were the foundation of the regime. Did the citizens truly not know? Or were they lying to protect themselves? The next story covers the American soldiers who took revenge on the SS guards at Dachau. That report is coming next.